The first conscious thought that all was not well with me came when I was 22. I had been living in Los Angeles for 2 years, working various temp jobs while trying to establish myself as a writer and performance artist. Out of nowhere and for no apparent reason, or so it seemed, I started feeling strong sensations of grief. I don't remember the step-by-step progression of the illness. What I can recall is that my life disintegrated, first, into a strange and terrifying space of sadness, and then, into a cobweb of fatigue. I gradually lost my ability to function. It would take me hours to get up out of bed, get bathed, put clothes on. By the time I was fully dressed, it was well into the afternoon. When I went out into the city, I would always become disoriented, often spacing out behind the wheel of my car or in the middle of a sentence. My thoughts would just disappear. I'd forget where I was driving to, the point I was about to make in conversation. It was as if my synapses were misfiring, my brain off kilter. A simple stroll to the coffee shop down the block overloaded my senses, sounds of feet shuffling on sidewalks, honks from cars, blinking of traffic lights, loud colors of clothing. It was all bewildering. After a while I stopped showing up at my temp job, stopped going out altogether, and locked myself in my home. It was over 3 weeks before I felt well enough to leave. During that time, I cut myself off from everything and everyone. Days would go by before I bathed. I did not have enough energy to clean up myself or my home. There was a trail of undergarments and other articles of clothing that ran from the living room to the bedroom to the bathroom of my tiny apartment. Dishes with decaying food covered every counter and tabletop in the place. Even watching TV or talking on the phone required too much concentration. All I could do was take to my pallet of blankets and coats positioned on the living room floor and wait for whatever I was going through to pass. And it did. Slowly. The problem is that there is no telling when depression will go away or for how long it will stay gone. During the time I was laid up in my apartment making huge efforts to do simple things like brush my teeth and pull open the curtains, people had traveled, landscapes had changed. The world as I had known it before I surrendered and crawled into bed was no more. There was no escaping that episode without acknowledging that something extraordinary had happened to me. Ordinary folks just don't hold themselves up for weeks on end without bathing, working, reading the newspaper, talking to friends, or watching TV. Deep down, I knew that something had gone wrong with me, in me. But what could I do? Stunned and defenseless, the only thing I felt I could do was move on. I assured myself that my mind and the behaviors it provoked were well within my control. In the future, I would just have to be extremely aware. I would make sure that what happened did not happen again. But it did. Again and again, no matter how aware, responsible, or in control I tried to be. Each time, I chastised myself for not paying attention to my emotions, for allowing myself to sink to such disgusting depths. Each wave of the depression cost me something dear. I lost my job because the temp agencies where I was registered could no longer tolerate my lengthy absences. Unable to pay rent, I lost my apartment and ended up having to rent a small room in a boarding house. I lost my friends. Most of them found it too troublesome to deal with my sudden moodiness and passivity, so they stopped calling and coming around. There were some that tried to hang in there and be supportive, but before long the depression took its toll on those relationships as well. Whenever I resurfaced from my episodes of depression, it was too hard to pick up where we had left off. "You've changed," my friends told me. "You're not the same person." How could I be? How could anyone be the same after their entire world has come to a screeching halt? Danqua, 1998. Most people's moods come and go. Their feelings of elation or sadness are understandable reactions to daily events and do not affect their lives greatly. However, the moods of certain people last a long time. As in the case of Mary Nanama Dankwa, a performance artist and poet who described her disorder above. Their moods color all of their interactions with the world and even interfere with normal functioning. Such people struggle in particular with depression, mania, or both. Depression is a low, sad state in which life seems dark and its challenges overwhelming. Mania, the opposite of depression, is a state of breathless euphoria, or at least frenzied energy, in which people may have an exaggerated belief that the world is theirs for the taking. Mood problems of these kinds are at the center of two groups of disorders: depressive disorders and bipolar disorders. These groups are examined in this chapter. People with depressive disorders suffer only from depression, a pattern called unipolar depression. They have no history of mania and return to a normal or nearly normal mood when their depression lifts. In contrast, those with bipolar disorders have periods of mania that alternate with periods of depression. You might logically expect some people to display a third pattern of mood difficulty, unipolar mania, in which they suffer from mania only, but this pattern is uncommon. Mood problems have always captured people's interest, in part because so many famous people have suffered from them. The Bible speaks of the severe depressions of Nebuchadnezzar, Saul, and Moses. Queen Victoria of England and Abraham Lincoln seem to have experienced recurring depressions. Mood difficulties also have plagued writers Ernest Hemingway and Sylvia Plath, comedians Jim Carrey and Rodney Dangerfield, and musical performers Eminem and Beyoncé. Their problems have been shared by millions, and today the economic costs of depressive and bipolar disorders amount to many billions of dollars each year. Of course, the human suffering that severe mood difficulties cause is beyond calculation. Unipolar depression, the depressive disorders. Whenever we feel particularly unhappy, we are likely to describe ourselves as depressed. In all likelihood, we are merely responding to sad events, fatigue, or unhappy thoughts. This loose use of the term confuses a perfectly normal mood swing with a clinical syndrome. All of us experience dejection from time to time, but only some experience a depressive disorder. Normal dejection is seldom severe enough to influence daily functioning significantly or persist very long. Such downturns in mood can even be beneficial. Periods spent in contemplation can lead us to explore our inner selves, our values, and our way of life, and we often emerge with an increased sense of strength, clarity, and resolve. Depressive disorders, on the other hand, have no redeeming characteristics. They bring severe and long-lasting psychological pain that may intensify as time goes by. Those who suffer from such disorders may lose their will to carry out the simplest of life's activities, some even lose their will to live. How common is unipolar depression? Around 9% of adults in the United States suffer from a severe unipolar pattern of depression in any given year, while as many as 5% suffer from mild forms. Around 18% of all adults experience an episode of severe unipolar depression at some point in their lives. These prevalence rates are similar in Canada, England, France, and many other countries. Moreover, the rate of depression, mild or severe, is higher among poor people than wealthier people. People of any age may suffer from unipolar depression. In most countries, however, people in their 40s are more likely than those in any other age group to experience this problem. The median age for its onset, now 26 in the United States, keeps dropping for each generation. And worldwide research projects suggest that the risk of experiencing unipolar depression has increased steadily since 1915. Women are at least twice as likely as men to have episodes of severe unipolar depression. As many as 26% of women have an episode at some time in their lives, compared with 12% of men. Among children, the prevalence of unipolar depression is similar for girls and boys. Approximately 85% of people with unipolar depression recover, some without treatment. At least 40% of them have at least one other episode of depression later in their lives. What are the symptoms of depression? The picture of depression may vary from person to person. Earlier you saw how Mary's profound sadness, fatigue, and cognitive deterioration brought her job and social life to a standstill. Some depressed people have symptoms that are less severe. They manage to function, although their depression typically robs them of much effectiveness or pleasure. As the case of Mary indicates, depression has many symptoms other than sadness. The symptoms, which often exacerbate one another, span 5 areas of functioning: emotional, motivational, behavioral, cognitive, and physical. Emotional symptoms: most people who are depressed feel sad and dejected. They describe themselves as feeling miserable, empty, and humiliated. They tend to lose their sense of humor, report getting little pleasure from anything, and in some cases display anhedonia, an inability to experience any pleasure at all. A number also experience anxiety, anger, or agitation. This sea of misery may lead to crying spells. Terry Williams, author of Black Pain, a book about depression in African Americans, describes the agony she went through each morning as her depression was unfolding. Nights I could handle. I fell asleep easily, and sleep allowed me to forget. But my mornings were unmanageable. To wake up each morning was to remember once again that the world by which I defined myself was no more. Soon after opening my eyes, the crying bouts would start and I'd sit alone for hours, weeping and mourning my losses. Williams, 2008. Motivational symptoms. Depressed people typically lose the desire to pursue their usual activities. Almost all report a lack of drive, initiative, and spontaneity. They may have to force themselves to go to work, talk with friends, eat meals, or have sex. This state has been described as a paralysis of will. Beck, 1967. Terry describes her social withdrawal during a depressive episode. I woke up one morning with a knot of fear in my stomach so crippling that I couldn't face light, much less day. And so intense that I stayed in bed for 3 days with the shades drawn and the lights out. 3 days. 3 days not answering the phone. 3 days not checking my email. I was disconnected completely from the outside world, and I didn't care. Then on the morning of the 4th day, there was a knock on my door. Since I hadn't ordered food, I ignored it. The knocking kept up and I kept ignoring it. I heard the sound of keys rattling in my front door. Slowly the bedroom door opened, and in the painful light from the doorway I saw the figures of 2 old friends. Terry, are you in there? Williams, 2008. Suicide represents the ultimate escape from life's challenges. Many depressed people become uninterested in life or wish to die. Others wish they could kill themselves, and some actually do. It has been estimated that between 6 and 15% of people who suffer from severe depression commit suicide. Behavioral symptoms. Depressed people are usually less active and less productive. They spend more time alone and may stay in bed for long periods. One man recalls, "I'd awaken early, but I'd just lie there. What was the use of getting up to a miserable day?" Depressed people may also move and even speak more slowly. Cognitive symptoms. Depressed people hold extremely negative views of themselves. They consider themselves inadequate, undesirable, inferior, perhaps evil. They also blame themselves for nearly every unfortunate event, even things that have nothing to do with them, and they rarely credit themselves for positive achievements. Another cognitive symptom of depression is pessimism. Sufferers are usually convinced that nothing will ever improve, and they feel helpless to change any aspect of their lives. Because they expect the worst, they are likely to procrastinate. Their sense of hopelessness and helplessness makes them especially vulnerable to suicidal thinking. People with depression frequently complain that their intellectual ability is poor. They feel confused, unable to remember things, easily distracted, and unable to solve even the smallest problems. In laboratory studies, depressed people do perform more poorly than non-depressed people on some tasks of memory, attention, and reasoning. It may be, however, that these difficulties sometimes reflect motivational problems rather than cognitive ones. Physical symptoms. People who are depressed frequently have such physical ailments as headaches, indigestion, constipation, dizzy spells, and general pain. In fact, many depressions are misdiagnosed as medical problems at first. Disturbances in appetite and sleep are particularly common. Most depressed people eat less, sleep less, and feel more fatigued than they did prior to the disorder. Some, however, eat and sleep excessively. Terry Williams describes the changes in the pattern of her sleep. At first I didn't notice the change. Then things got worse. I always hated waking up, but slowly it was turning into something deeper. It was less like I didn't want to wake up, and more like I couldn't. I didn't feel tired, but I had no energy. I didn't feel sleepy, but I would have welcomed sleep with open arms. I had the sensation of a huge weight, invisible but gigantic, pressing down on me, almost crushing me into the bed and pinning me there. Williams, 2008. Diagnosing Unipolar Depression. According to DSM-5, a major depressive episode is a period of 2 or more weeks marked by at least 5 symptoms of depression, including sad mood and/or loss of pleasure. In extreme cases, the episode may include psychotic symptoms, ones marked by a loss of contact with reality, such as delusions, bizarre ideas without foundation, or hallucinations, perceptions of things that are not actually present. A depressed man with psychotic symptoms may imagine that he cannot eat because my intestines are deteriorating and will soon stop working, or he may believe that he sees his dead wife. DSM-5 lists several types of depressive disorders. People who go through a major depressive episode without having any history of mania receive a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. The disorder may be additionally categorized as seasonal if it changes with the seasons, for example, if the depression recurs each winter. Catatonic if it is marked by either immobility or excessive activity, peripartum if it occurs during pregnancy or within 4 weeks of giving birth. Or melancholic if the person is almost totally unaffected by pleasurable events. It sometimes turns out that an apparent case of major depressive disorder is, in fact, a depressive episode occurring within a larger pattern of bipolar disorder, a pattern in which the person's manic episode has not yet appeared. When the person has a manic episode at a later time, the diagnosis is changed to bipolar disorder. People whose unipolar depression is chronic receive a diagnosis of persistent depressive disorder. Some people with this chronic disorder have repeated major depressive episodes, a pattern technically called persistent depressive disorder with major depressive episodes. Others have less severe and less disabling symptoms, a pattern technically called persistent depressive disorder with dysthymic syndrome. A third type of depressive disorder is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, a diagnosis given to certain women who repeatedly have clinically significant depressive and related symptoms during the week before menstruation. This inclusion of this pattern in DSM-5 is controversial, as you will observe later. Yet another kind of depressive disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, is characterized by a combination of persistent depressive symptoms and recurrent outbursts of severe temper. This disorder emerges during mid-childhood or adolescence, disorders common among children and adolescents.
you.